Hello, I'm Dr. Ross Abbinnett. I'm Associate Professor of Social and Political Theory at the University of Birmingham. Today I'll be talking to you about Karl Marx, and I want to start off by looking at Marx's theory of labour. This is something that gets developed throughout his work, and it's a theme that he addresses right the way through his entire body of work, from his earliest writings in the Paris manuscripts, which I'll look at in a second, right the way through to Capital, which I'll look at later on. Okay, so let's have a look at what Marx says about human labour in the Paris manuscripts, or as it's sometimes known, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. One of the things to remember about this is it's an early piece of work. He was 27 when he wrote it. And some scholars tend to regard this as a piece of juvenilia, something that Marx came to reject, this kind of rather romantic conception of labour, came to reject later on when he became a kind of hard-nosed economic theorist, whereas others see it as the core of his work. There's a long section on labour in the economic and philosophical manuscripts where Marx talks about what the essence of human labour is. Now, one of the things that we can thematise discussion around is this idea of an old philosophical question about the distinction between humans and animals. And what Marx is doing, what Marx says, is that it's the way they produce their means of subsistence. Okay, so there's an idea that human beings self-consciously produce the things that they need to survive. All communities, right from the start of what we understand as human civilization, do so through conscious forms of organisation through which the means of subsistence, the material things that we need to survive, like food and shelter, the kind of basic material things, is done so in a way which is conscious, organised and concerted. There's a kind of purpose to it. And this is incredibly important for Marx because this is what distinguishes them from animals. Right? All other species produce their means of subsistence through instinctive behaviour. And from the very start, from the first hunter-gatherer societies, the process of hunting things, of skinning things, of cooking them, of the way in which the significance of the act of hunting, etc., is organised in the kind of order of society. This is something which transforms human beings from simple instinctual animal beings into things or beings that have a culture. So the culture is based upon the way in which human beings produce their means of subsistence, the way in which their societies are organised to make sure that that means of subsistence is reproduced. So that's the first thing about human labour. The way we do it is the thing that distinguishes us from animals. The second thing about human labour is that if we begin from this premise that there's something special about human labour, there's an idea that human labour is dialectical. So there's a dialectical relationship between human labour and the world. We're transformed by it and the world is transformed by us. Our consciousness enters into a kind of commerce with the world. We're confronted with a kind of brute materiality which we transform when we work on it. Men, or rather human beings, leave their mark on the material world by transforming it through their activity. And again, what we need to come back to here is this is a social relationship. This transformation does not take place through the individual activity of atomistic human beings. It is something which is from the beginning social. It is from the beginning an organisation of each one into the group. And this idea of sociality is something which is incredibly important throughout Marx's work. And we'll come back to that when we start to talk about his idea of what a communist society actually looks like. So there's a dialectical relationship that exists between human activity and the world. Human beings transform themselves through labour, and the world itself is transformed. There's one last thing which is worth mentioning around this idea of human labour. There's an idea that the highest ends that human beings can attain is through a kind of labour which is not based upon the idea that you have to do it merely to supply your material needs. It's done on the basis of the pursuit of beauty. And again, that's something which is really important when we come to talk about what a communist society is. It's a free form of labour that is creative, that makes the world over on the basis of ideas of beauty. And that this pursuit of higher, almost transcendent ends is something that can only happen when the group is organised in a way that all of its members are not crushed by the material need simply to keep body and soul together. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the way, the way that human labour is organised. There's an idea in the Paris manuscript which is very important, and the idea is that the essence of human labour is collective. And so there's a concept that runs throughout Marx's theory of labour and also his theory of knowledge, that human self-development is something that can only occur within social conditions and economic conditions that support the capacity of each individual to be able to develop and self-realise. So there's an idea that the part of the kind of the horizon, if you like, of Marx's thought is this notion of a society in which each individual is supplied by that society so that they are able to fulfill their maximum potential. Last thing, there's a section, an important section in the Paris manuscript, called Estranged Labor, and this is something which leads on to Marx's idea of alienation. And this is interesting because it prefigures Marx's critique of capitalism, but it does it in a quite idealistic way, which is based upon the experience of labour that individuals have under a capitalist society, the kind of propertyless wage workers that are characteristic of capitalist societies. And he talks about 4 phases of alienation, and it's worth just mentioning these very briefly because I can come back to them later. The first is that under capitalism, the product or object of your labour is taken from you. You produce something, and that is immediately taken from you and sold for profit. The second is the process of labour. The process of labour itself under capitalism, according to Marx, is something which is profoundly alienating. And it's alienating because it is not collective. It is isolating. Think of the production line. The process of creation there is something which is actively alienating of human nature and human essence. There's also an idea about the idea that human beings are alienated from each other. So there's an idea that under market conditions, we're all in competition with each other. And so the atomistic individuals that we become through these economic processes are self-interested and unable to recognise their mutual interest in trying to produce a society which supports everybody, and also to participate in a form of labour which is fulfilling. So there's an idea that we become these kind of atomistic and antagonistic individuals. And finally, the last one, alienation from species being. Human beings are supposed to labour in a way that is fulfilling, that pursues higher ends, that is related to these kind of principles of aesthetics and beauty that Marx talked about. That is our species being. That's what, in a sense, is the essence of humanity. Under capitalism, Marx maintains that we do not produce in terms of this essence. We simply produce to be able to subsist. And so what should be the fulfillment of human life, creative labour, it becomes something which is mutilating. It becomes something which is not just physically, but also spiritually mutilating, because it denies what we are.